Good afternoon and welcome to the Lair Student Center at Spokane Community College and the second and final debate in the 2018 race for U.S. Senate. I'm Haley Gunther with KHQ Local News.
And I'm Jane McCarthy with KREM 2 News. This debate has been organized by the Washington State Debate Coalition, which was founded by Seattle City Club in 2016 to enhance Washingtonians' access to those who hold and seek our state's highest offices. Financial support has been provided by our lead sponsors, AARP of Washington, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Norcliffe Foundation. We also want to thank the community colleges of Spokane for hosting this debate in partnership with Gonzaga University, Eastern Washington University, the University of Washington, Washington State University Spokane, and Whitworth University.
This is a town hall style debate, and the questions today will come from the hundreds of people here at Spokane Community College. Aside from asking questions, the audience has agreed to remain silent and to hold their applause until the end of the debate, except for now as we meet the candidates. Democratic Senator Maria Cantwell.
Hey, everybody.
And Republican Susan Hutchison.
And welcome to you both. As you watch this debate, we invite you to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag WAELEX, and that is WAELEX. Now, to the format of this debate. The town hall, the questions will come from the audience, both here in the room and from our broader audience via social media who have posted questions online. Each debate, each candidate will have 1 minute for a reply, and then the moderators will lead a follow-up discussion on the topic before moving to the next question. There will also be 1 minute in closing statements to wrap up this debate. So let's get started. Jim Camden with the Spokesman Review has a question with an audience member.
Ladies, I have Frank Malone here who has a question on the topic of the environment. Question goes first to Senator Cantwell, and you each have 1 minute.
Thank you.
Do you believe in climate change, and is it a threat to Washington's coast? Are there steps that should be taken to protect Washington from its effects?
Thank you. Thanks for asking that question, and thank you for wearing that great hat and for your service to our country. My colleague Susan Collins and I did a report, basically asked the government accountability how much climate was impacting us. They said it cost us $650 billion every 10 years because of its effect on our coastline, on our shellfish, the effects we're seeing in catastrophic fires, and that we need to do something about it. So I definitely support making sure that we are not only mitigating the impacts of climate change, but preserving great things that help us reduce fossil fuels, like keeping our mileage per gallon fuel efficiency that we implemented a decade ago. That's very important because it helps consumers save on their cost of gas, but also helps us save on our environment.
Ms. Hutchison, you have a minute to respond.
Well, first of all, I notice your cap says Vietnam and Desert Storm. So again, thank you for your service. I remember that you asked the question, you said, do you believe in climate change? And the word believe is associated with faith. And I just want to make sure that when we're talking about climate change, we base all our decisions on science. You know, when you combine politics and science, you end up with junk science. And certainly we have to, with a problem as significant as the changing climate, we have to be sure that our decisions as we go forward are grounded in good science and are clear of politics. And this is one of the problems that I have with those that use climate change as a wedge in politics. Of all subjects, if it affects the entire world, shouldn't this be a subject that draws us all together? Shouldn't we be working together to bring the best scientists in all the fields that are impacted or have a contribution to make when it comes to determining what impacts climate change are going to have? You know, we've had climate change since the beginning of time. So what are the impacts going to do? Okay, we'll discuss it in a few minutes.
Let's continue on this topic. And how much of climate change that we're seeing right now do each of you think is connected to human activity? Senator?
Well, as I mentioned, there is impacts, and that is exactly what the scientists say. So the plan is, let's make reductions in those greenhouse gases that we know are detrimental to our environment. I helped author tax credits to go to more renewable energy, so wind and solar and biofuels, and our state is leading in that. That's very important because if we can change our energy sources to a cleaner sources of energy along with our hydro system, that's going to make for a better environment for the future.
Okay, Ms. Hutchison, how much of climate change, since it's been going on since the beginning of time?
Well, again,
right now is
again, I would defer to the scientists to make that decision. Certainly, we have an example with the ozone hole that was over Australia and the southern hemisphere for a while, and we tackled that by banning chlorofluorocarbons. And as we quit using those in spray cans, we began to close that hole. And so we have seen how human behavior can change the atmosphere in a way. But we also have to be really careful as we move forward to always balance against the needs of our developing economies. We don't want to make those who are forced to make decisions that they're not ready to make as they're needing a growth in energy. We need energy to be clean as possible, and that yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I'd gone over. Did I have a time?
Well,
yeah.
We're not timing these, but we want to give both candidates equal time. Yeah. Was President Trump right to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accords, and our governors, like Governor Jay Inslee on the West Coast, were they correct in trying to have their states meet those requirements? Senator?
Well, I disagree with pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. One of our leading citizens in our state, Bill Gates, made a major economic investment and tried to get the rest of the world best scientists and investors in innovation that are going to help us deal with this problem for the future. So I definitely believe in a more collaborative approach. And here was Bill Gates waiting for the United States to continue that effort so he could continue on the innovation side. And when the president said we're not going to support that, it is not working together with those nations that could help us address this. It is a big challenge.
Ms. Hutchison, was the president right? And if he was right, are the governors wrong?
I think that what the president was saying is we're not going to have an uneven playing field here. When the major polluters in the world are China and India right now, as their growing economies are throwing so much pollution into the air, why should the United States be penalized and they get a pass for several decades? So the president is basically saying this climate accord is not really fair and it's not going to work. And so in the pragmatic way of looking at solutions to our environment, I think it's important that we make sure that whatever we pursue is going to work.
Senator, is the governor right and the other governors on the West Coast to try and maintain these standards?
Well, it's important to create market opportunities. And in Washington, we have several counties who have taken it upon themselves to do the leadership role. So they've decided to make a whole wind overlay. So if a governor wants to help push that along, too, it's a good idea because, as our counties have done, gotten lots of second crops for our farmers. They get wind and they get wheat or something else. And so it works to help us.
Hard to cut off a senator, but back to Haley.
All right. Thank you, Jim and Frank, for that. For our next question, let's go to Mark Baumgarten, the news and politics editor at KCTS 9 Crosscut in Seattle. You have another member of the audience with you, Mark.
Thanks, Haley. We have Maya Crawford here. She has a question about trade for you.
Will you advocate to lift tariffs on our allies and trade partners?
You each have 1 minute to answer. Let's start with Ms. Hutchison.
I'll go first. Thank you.
Yes.
You know, I believe that the best free trade is fair trade. And what we are seeing right now in the tariff discussions around the world with President Trump and the administration is an effort to make the playing field even, which has been uneven for a very long time. The average percentage of tariff that we place on other goods is about 3.5%. The Europeans put about 5%. And do you know the Chinese 10%? But of course, that's grown now that they're in discussions. I am very pleased with what the administration has been able to negotiate when it comes to the agreement with Mexico and the agreement with Canada, the EU with South Korea. And I expect that he is going to do an awful lot on behalf of our farmers and others who export to China when the trade agreement is discussed there. Tariffs are a tool, and I believe the president is using them in order to get the Chinese to the table.
Senator Cantwell, you have 1 minute.
Yes, I will work to make sure that we're lifting tariffs on product made in our state that is now being penalized in other parts of the world. I think tariffs are a last resort, not a first resort. I hope that we continue to modernize agreements like the Mexico agreement. Originally, the president said it wasn't a good agreement, but yet we have grown our exports from $300 million to $2 billion from our state. But now those products are still, even with the modernization of Mexico, still facing tariffs. So why should apples and cherries and potatoes still face additional tariffs in Mexico when it has become a big economic market opportunity for us? So I want them to be used as a last resort, not a first resort.
Senator Cantwell, just building on that, do you have plans to support the United States Mexico-Canada agreement?
Yes, I do want to say that we want to keep modernizing and opening up markets as this does on digital issues. And there are some important dairy concessions that Canada was making a market distortion by supporting dairy prices. So I will do that. But you can bet that I'm going to bring up to all my colleagues in the United States Senate that we have not fully got nominees on the Export-Import Bank, a credit agency that the other side keeps dragging their feet on. Now, export opportunities are key here in the Northwest. I held up the Senate to get the Export-Import Bank reauthorized, but now we can't sell Boeing planes because they don't have a functioning board. So I'm going to make this point while we have this discussion in November. We need both. We need to open markets, and we have to have credit assistance for our companies to gain access to markets.
Given that you see the new trade agreement with Mexico and Canada as having some advantages, I mean, it's considered a win for labor. Certainly opening up the dairy market in Canada is seen as a victory. Doesn't that validate the president's approach of a more aggressive policy that uses tariffs to push our trade partners to a fair deal?
As I said, I believe in tariffs last, not tariffs first. So here we're still dealing with Mexico, and it would have been great to modernize. And as Richard Haass said, the head of the Foreign Council, yes, he doesn't think it's a cataclysmic new deal. So what I'm trying to explain is that when we do agreements like Mexico the first time, it had huge growth for us as market opportunity. So I want to grow on top of them. But now, because of this dispute, we have our products seeing as much as 50% tariffs on their product. And what I worry about is farmers losing shelf space. While this debate goes on for another year or so, does some farm not make it through this season? Does somebody lose shelf space, and next year when they go back to Asia, somebody else, Australia, has got the market space and they don't want to buy from us?
All right, I'd like to get Ms. Cantwell's response to this in particular. You know, the president urges patience. How much patience can we expect? I mean, how long is a reasonable amount of time before tariffs turn to agreements with China, say?
Hutchison.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
I'm so sorry.
I just want to make it clear that to our television audience that you were asking the question of me. So I have the endorsement of the Washington Farm Bureau. It's a very important group of people in this state. And I've had a lot of discussions with people who produce hay or cherries or apples and other farm products around the state. And they have said over and over, it has been such an unfair and unlevel playing field for so long that we are grateful that we finally have a president. These problems preceded President Trump, but we finally have a president who is willing to take it to the Chinese and make sure that we negotiate fair trade agreements.
So farmers in the state are suffering. There's a $12 billion bill to help them across the country. How much longer are they expected to have that market altered before there's
Well, as I've talked to them, and I really went to them to ask their opinion about how they felt about the tariffs, and they said they're willing to accept short-term pain for long-term gain. I have seen President Trump move at a speed that most of us have never seen in any administration. And so the renegotiation of NAFTA is an indication of that. We all tend to be fairly impatient. We want things to go well very quickly. And I think there is a point at which that if we don't have an agreement, because I can talk to President Trump, my opponent cannot. She's a member of the Resist and has made it very clear that she can't talk to the president. Because I can talk to him, I can be an advocate for Washington State and speak very strongly to the president about moving things along.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mark and Maya, for your question as well. Our next question is from Chris Schroll, who has a question about health care. Chris, what is your question?
Would you support legislation creating a single-payer Medicare for All system in America? If not, what would you do to propose providing access to high-quality health care?
Thank you, Chris. Senator Cantwell, 1 minute.
Thank you for that question, and it's such an important one. I do believe that access to health care is a basic right, and we should have universal access. I prefer something that I authored in the Affordable Care Act, the Basic Health Plan. The concept is working now in several states, and basically people are able to buy insurance for just $35 a month if they qualify. That includes prescription benefits as well as dental. Why does that work? Well, we had it for a while in our state. The concept is simple. Bundle up individuals and small businesses who don't have the same clout as a large company like Boeing. But if you bundle up 40 or 50 or 250,000 people, now you can force a discount from the drug manufacturers and from the providers. That's what worked in the Basic Health Plan here when it was in our state, and now it's working in New York, where over 700,000 people are buying insurance, as I said, for just $35.
Thank you. Ms. Hutchison, 1 minute.
Well, I grew up in socialized medicine, and so no matter what the Democrats want to call it, whether it's single payer or universal health care or Medicare for all, it's socialized medicine, and I've lived it. And let me tell you what it feels like. You stand in line for a very, very long time, and then you don't get a doctor who cares about you. You just get whoever is available. And so as a military dependent, we were called, that's the health care I experienced. And I would fight any attempt by the federal government to take over this high-quality health care that we enjoy in America that is the finest in the world. I can't imagine that we would gain by having the government take it over. And so it's very important to me that access and lower cost is the way that we improve our health system. And there are many different ways that health care is delivered. Obamacare came in sort of switch gears. It had no support by Republicans at all, and it had to be passed using a procedural trick in order to get it passed. And because of that, it doesn't have bipartisan agreement. And the next health reform that we do will have bipartisan agreement, because that is the only way we as a country have to move forward.
Senator Cantwell, you talk about the Basic Health Plan. So if that is implemented specifically, what are the real hurdles to making that happen?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because Marcus Rochelli here is a local state Representatives is working hard on getting that passed here in our state. Our state has to decide, like New York and Minnesota, that they want to pursue that option because the legislation gives them that right. But it also helps our state, just as the Affordable Care Act did. Here in Spokane, 30,000 people got access to health care. You have 165,000 people on Medicaid. And they now, in this community, are part of an ecosystem. The number one employer here in Spokane is healthcare. So I want people to have affordable access to healthcare. I want great providers to be here in Spokane, and I want the solution to work for us. And I'm so glad that Marcus is leading the way in Olympia to get it done.
Ms. Hutchison?
Well, I think we need to clarify, because the question was single-payer health plans or single-payer health care, and I don't think we've gotten an answer yet from my opponent, although I've heard her explain it many times on the campaign trail. She is in favor of socialized medicine. In other words, a government takeover of our medical care. And I am not, as I said earlier. So I want to make that important distinction. The other thing is what she's talking about health organizations in the Spokane area, those are private. They're privately run for the most part, except for, of course, the Air Force and the medical care that's provided at Fairchild. So universal health care or socialized medicine would make all of your plans illegal. None of us want that. It would mean a takeover of all of our hospitals, our private hospitals, and our public hospitals, a takeover of all of that. That is not what we want. And when you hear something like $35 for a month for your health care, that is heavily subsidized, which means your taxes go up even more than they already are.
Senator Cantwell, we do have another question from a viewer about opioids. How do you feel about the war on opiates as it relates to the impact on chronic pain patients who are being cut off from opiate medication and new pain patients who are denied treatment with opiates? 30 seconds, please.
Well, thank you for the question. We've been from Port Angeles to Spokane talking about this issue and hearing from the local community about how to deal with this issue. So I'm glad we just got a new opioid bill passed. But yes, we are working now with physicians and clinics on what pain management really should look like. We're not turning someone away from the needed medicine that they have to have for whatever challenges, but we're trying to get away from this very addictive drug that is now being diverted into so many places that is causing catastrophic events on us. So thank you.
One of the most important elements of this bill that passed 99-1 is that over $1 billion is being allocated to fight the crossing of fentanyl from Mexico. Fentanyl, of course, as you know, is a substitute or a heroin substitute that has been cheaply produced in Mexico. So part of my question for Senator Cantwell, she's so soft on the border. How is it that we can have such an open border policy from the Democrats, and yet these drugs continue to flow over the border? I'm glad that the bill that passed 99-1 allocates money in order to solve that problem, or at least make a dent in it, because there's no question that drugs are flooding across the southern border.
We'd like to give you an opportunity to respond.
Well, the bill is great in the fact that it's giving law enforcement more tools. And we met with Ozzie here, and we met with Sheriff Pasteur in Tacoma, and they basically said, more money for HIDA grants, which help us fight gang activity because they get their hands on the distribution. Pass this new law so that we can crack down on the distribution by having the tools to go after people who are distributing it. And I had 39 attorney generals, Republicans and Democrats, said, yes, take Maria's language and put it in that bill. So that's what we did. And it also includes new language to crack down on the mail-in, which is coming from foreign countries of this product. So it's great new tools asked for by our law enforcement agents, and I'm glad we got it done.
Thank you. And thank you, Chris, for that question.
Our next topic here this afternoon is the economy. We have Edwin Aguli here. You have a question about the high cost of living here in Washington. Edwin?
Thank you. Housing supply and affordability issues affect every community in Washington, limiting new job development and the money consumers have left over to spend. What is your solution to our state's ongoing housing crisis?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. I turned to my colleague, my opponent. Senator Cantwell had a heavy hand in developing the Growth Management Act for this state, which occurred about 29, 30 years ago in the legislature. There is no question, but we have outgrown the Growth Management Act. Everywhere I go across this state, people are concerned about the cost of housing. And so when we're talking about housing affordability so that you can find a home that you can afford and that your children could stay in the same region as they grow up and try to access housing is very, very important. So what has happened is the cost of land has gone up so high that we no longer can expand outside our metropolitan areas and build houses that don't cost very much. The other problem is that 40% of every home that's built, every apartment, goes to red tape in this state. It is a crisis, and it has to change. And that is something I'm committed to when I'm your senator.
Thank you so much for asking that question. I just led the charge in the United States Senate with my colleague Orrin Hatch from Utah to increase a program that is a public-private partnership to build more affordable housing. What people don't know is that we are in a crisis of affordable housing here in Spokane, in Seattle, in many parts of our country, because we haven't kept pace with supply. What increasing the affordable housing tax credit did was allow us to get more projects built. And as soon as we passed that bill, the very first thing the commission here in Washington announced is a new project at Airway Heights. But if I want you to know anything about how great a tool this is for veterans, for aging population, for people who need to be close to workforce, no better example than the Rid Path Hotel in Spokane. It is now being renovated using the affordable housing tax credit for workplace housing in downtown Spokane. This program works. I'm going to go back with Orrin when we go back in November and try to get even more done on this because, as you can see, we need more supply.
What about skyrocketing rent? There are so many families here in Spokane that are spending half of everything they make every single month just to pay for a roof over their heads. What can you think can be done to help ease the burden on some of these families? Ms. Hutchison?
And again, the rent is the same. They pay that same 40%, the people who build those rental units, the same 40%. They cannot build housing that is affordable anymore because of what government has done. Government is not the answer in housing until they can provide incentives that help developers build, especially around transit. Build the kind of affordable housing that they can actually afford to build as developers so that people can actually afford to rent them. And again, this is an issue where there's too much government in the way with permitting and fees and red tape, and we need to get rid of it.
Well, that is exactly what the affordable housing tax credit does, is incent developers to build more affordable housing where otherwise they wouldn't. And what's great about continuing to make this focus is because if you don't have enough supply in the marketplace, then that is left over, the demand goes up, and basically people are getting higher and higher rents. We have to go back and look at some of these projects that were built years ago, and then as we came out of the downturn, people converted affordable housing into higher market rate programs. That's what's happened in Seattle, that happened in Tacoma, and I'll bet you it's happening here in Spokane. So it is about building more supply. The good news is that is actually stimulative. To build more construction and to make housing affordable is a good answer, not just for the residents, but for our communities and the economy.
Thank you.
And thank you, Edwin, for that initial question. Now let's go back to Jim Camden with the Spokesman Review with another member of the audience.
I have Jacob Wetham here, and he has a question about politics and political style.
Thank you. President Trump ran on getting rid of the swamp in D.C. What would you do to help lift the Senate out of the swamp and heal the damage done to our political system?
Well, thank you so much for that question. It's very important that we continue to make reforms in Washington, D.C. I try to work across the aisle and make sure that our colleagues understand that our ideas are coming from people of Washington state. This is so important because whether we're talking about fire and trying to get a fix for fire funding or whether we're doing something like affordable housing, you have to have the ideas and the people in our state. So even though we didn't necessarily agree. My colleagues, Senator Risch and Crapo, on a lot of issues. On this issue, we agreed. So taking good science and information and making that the basis of our decision making is the most important thing we could do.
I don't think that was the intent of the question. I think the question was asking about what's going on in Washington, D.C., which gives so much power to special interests and lobbyists. And my opponent in this race is a poster child for being a D.C. insider and taking advantage of that insidious relationship between politicians and special interests. If you take a look at her FEC filings, you can find, at least this year, over $1 million from lawyers. Those lawyers represent special interests, and they expect a return on their investment. Another $500,000 comes from people who call themselves consultants. Well, that's a euphemism for lobbyist. And so at least $500,000 worth of personal money from lobbyists has come the way of Senator Cantwell in order to make sure she's on their side. And I am not a professional politician. I know a thing or two about politics, having led the GOP party for the last half decade. But I do know that term limits is one of the ways to stop this problem.
Okay. The Senate is a great place to filibuster, but debate's not so much. So I'm going to try and get a couple of quick questions in here with individual answers. Senator Cantwell, do you agree with the the tactic some Democrats suggest that when they go low, we kick them?
No.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, I go. Ms. Hutchison, different question. Does it help or hurt the political discourse in national politics when the president uses nicknames for people like Lying Ted, Crooked Hillary, or Horseface?
No.
Okay, we're doing good here. Senator Cantwell, if Democrats regain control of the Senate, would you support reinstating the 60-vote requirement to cut off debate on Supreme Court nominations?
I think it's very good that we go back and consider that. I do. And the reason is I want a Senate that works well together. And I want to make sure that as we continue to move forward, that we are the cooling saucer, as it is often said, to the contrast to the House. So definitely would consider going back to that.
Different question for Ms. Hutchison. If a vacancy occurs on the Supreme Court in 2020, should President Trump be allowed to fill it?
In 2020, when he's running for re-election?
Yes.
Well, that's an interesting question because, of course, the Senate decided not to move forward, as everybody knows, with the nomination during an election year. But we had two people running for president who are not incumbents. And so the difference here is that there's an incumbent running for re-election. But I do believe it depends upon the vacancy that would occur and at what point it is in the cycle. So I think people in all of America can be pleased that President Trump kept his promise and has appointed two people who are constitutionalists that uphold the rule of law through the Constitution.
So that was a maybe.
Yes.
A question more about leadership style than political style. Do you believe President Trump is properly handling questions around the death of Jamal Khashoggi and our relationship with Saudi Arabia? And we go first to Senator Cantwell.
I want our president and members of Congress to say clearly, we do not, as a nation, support the killing of media by governments or their agents, that we will get to the bottom of this, that we will use the tools that we have available to make sure that we are speaking for the rule of law and certainly for the freedom of the press. And so I want everyone to be saying that, and I hope that this will be heard around the world.
Ms. Hutchison.
As a former journalist, I take these sort of incidences very seriously. And this particular one has gotten a lot of attention because he worked for the Washington Post. But I do want to remind us that hundreds of journalists have been murdered in Mexico because they got too close to the drug cartels. And there's no one standing up for them. As we take a look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia, there have been 18 arrests now, and I think 5 dismissals from the Crown Prince's inner circle. This is a step forward, as they have admitted that this was wrong. And I do think as we move forward as well, we have to remember that the Saudis play an important counterbalance to the Iranians and the Syrians in the Middle East. We have to look at all the players in the Middle East with eyes wide open.
Okay. Senator Cantwell, are we doing enough to pressure the Saudis, and should the question of how much they contribute to both the region and our economy come into this?
I've already voted in the United States Senate to say in the situation in Yemen that we shouldn't continue to support them in their efforts involved in a civil war if we're having that level of human tragedy and loss of life. So I do want to hold them accountable. We have 3 tools that we'll be considering: sanctions on individuals that are involved, this issue of whether we continue to support them in Yemen, which is turning into one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world, and to look at this issue of arms sales. All of those should be on the table, and we will consider all of those when we find out how high up this went in the Saudi Arabian government.
Thank you.
Senator, thank you. Jacob, thank you for the question as well. We do have another questioner who is with KCTS 9 Crosscut Politics editor Mark Baumgarten. Mark?
Thanks, Haley. Now we have Ali Mershawn. She has a question about immigration.
Thank you, Mark. As you know, Spokane and many cities in the state of Washington consider themselves sanctuary cities. Do you support sanctuary cities in the state of Washington, and why?
Ms. Hutchison?
No, I don't. We are a country of the rule of law, and I think that any time a municipality takes the law into their own hands and disregards what the law is for the nation, we put ourselves on a slippery slope. I think if the law needs to be changed, people of goodwill need to work together to fix the law. I don't think that sanctuary cities is beneficial to the whole discussion of immigration reform, which certainly does need reform, no question about it. And both illegal and legal immigration need to be looked at and fixed very quickly. And so thank you for the question, and I stand against the designation called sanctuary cities.
I definitely support our local governments and our local law enforcement who have said, do not penalize us as you pursue a course on immigration that oftentimes has been struck down by the courts. So why should the sheriff in either Snohomish County or the sheriff in Cowlitz County be penalized in not getting federal dollars just because they don't agree with the administration's approach? So I have seen law enforcement across our state handle this problem very deftly, but they have been clear. They want the resources to continue to do what they do. They're on the front lines of this crisis, and they want to go after the people that are really responsible, and they are doing that. But we shouldn't take away their resources.
I have a follow-up for Ms. Hutchison. Another hot-button issue, family separation. So in the spring, we saw, the administration doing forced separations. Since your last debate, we've seen the Washington Post report that the administration is considering a new approach which would force families who are coming across the border illegally to choose between either being held together for an indefinite amount of time or having the parents sign over their children to another facility that would then help with the aim of placing them with a guardian or a family member. Would you support that policy?
Well, I think when it comes to whatever the administration decides to enforce along the border, it's very important that we think in terms of what we can do to stem the tide of this porous border of ours and the entry that has been illegal and that has caused so much political discussion for so long. We know that the people of Washington State consider immigration to be the #1 issue in our lives. And you know why it is? It's because they see that the illegal or crossing of our southern border is a national security issue. and they're afraid. They're afraid what it's going to do to our country in so many ways. We've already talked about the drugs and the drug cartels, the billion-dollar business that they run.
I'd like to stay on this issue of family separation, though.
Well, let me just go on the record. I've been on the record many times, that I don't agree with family separation except for the safety of children. And if you talk to the border control officers who have been there, they know that part of what the drug cartels are doing is using children to come across in child trafficking, and they're often accompanied most often by an adult who is not their legal guardian or their parent. And so all of this is very complicated, and I do know that our border control works really diligently to do the right thing and the humane thing on behalf of families.
Senator Cantwell, so your opponent said that you're soft on the border. I'd like you to respond to that within the context of the fact that we have seen such an increase in the number of families that are crossing the border this year.
Well, definitely don't believe in family separation, and don't believe in touting that you're going to reinstate it again as a way to deal with this problem. I do want border security and have voted for border security. I believe, as Tom Ridge said, that if you're going to try to build a wall all the way across thousands of miles of our border, we're not going to be successful. So I kind of take it personally on the northern border when they want to close the crossing at Danville or Medellin Falls and say they don't have enough money to keep that open. That affects our commerce, and we're going to do some idea that we know is not cost effective. So I do believe in technology. I believe in stronger border agents, and I believe in moving some of our borders overseas to the most dangerous airports so that we don't have people coming into our country. But on this issue, the main thing here is stability of those countries where we are seeing exodus of people because they are one of the most dangerous places in the world. We shouldn't be telling them we're going to take money away from them. We should be getting the entire region in Central America to support them and help stabilize with good government, crack down on narcotics, and helping those countries have a more stable environment so we don't have asylum seekers coming to our borders.
And do you support going back to a catch and release policy with families?
The asylum would work as people come to our border and ask for asylum. They would go through a review process. That was what the normal process was. You would not be separated. And I think there are more cost-effective ways to doing it. They are not allowed to stay in our country, but you can, while you're going through the process, detain them with more cost-effective ways.
Ms. Hutchison, so I'd like to talk about another issue with immigration. The guest worker policy in the country is largely viewed as being
I apologize.
flawed.
I need to interrupt. I'm sorry. We're out of time on that topic.
I think I lost.
We need to move on to Washington priorities. And our next question came to us online. James Burkett asks, what have you done in the past and what are you going to do in the future to make sure the views and voices of folks in Eastern Washington are not just heard, but represented in policy? So we'll start with Senator Cantwell, 1 minute.
Well, that's a great question. One of the biggest priorities we have right now here in this part of the state is to renew the Columbia River Treaty. That's an agreement between the United States and Canada, but it affects our hydro system. If you will, we're paying a little more to Canada than we need to pay right now for that hydro system. Why is that so important? It's important because we can't afford to pay any more for our electric needs than we need to pay. We need to continue to be cost effective. So I was able to work with the last administration, and I do applaud President Trump for making this Columbia River Treaty a priority and getting it down the road in the formal parts of the negotiation. But we can't go another 5 or 6 years without this being renegotiated. We need it renegotiated with Canada and modernize our hydro system for the benefit of both countries.
Ms. Hutchison, 1 minute.
Well, I think it's an important question because I live in Seattle, and I know that Seattle has a very strong population and a very left-wing government that controls so many ideas and policies that eventually begin to spread throughout the state. And so I think that it's important that Senator Cantwell understand I have been throughout Eastern Washington through this campaign and for the 5 years that 39 counties are represented in the GOP committee. And I know that the folks who live in Eastern Washington do not feel represented. And often when I am with them, they say, she's never here. We never see her. In 18 years, we've never seen Senator Cantwell. And the second thing we hear is, what has she ever done for us? And so I want you to know that I will be here for you. I love Eastern Washington. And to your question that we didn't get to answer, the guest worker program is so essential for our farmers. And definitely, it needs to be upgraded. It needs to be modernized. We need to make it so much more efficient for our farmers to bring in those guest workers for seasonally harvesting our crops.
Thank you. Senator Cantwell, do you have a response to Ms. Hutchison saying you're never in Eastern Washington?
I've gotten to pass 4 bills this year in the United States Senate incorporated in larger legislation, thanks to the people of Washington. I never would have had that opioid bill that we got passed if I hadn't been to dozens of locations around the state and heard firsthand, like in Mason County, how devastating it would be. I can guarantee you I spent summers traveling to Colville, to Chewelah, to Omak, to Chelan, listening to our fire problems, and even had meetings with your congressperson, Kathy McMorris-Rogers. I think she's mentioned this in a couple of debates about how we work together on fire. We would not gotten those solutions if I hadn't heard firsthand and had the ammunition from people here in the state about how to go back there and fight the battle and win the day to get us more money to fight fires. So my best ideas come from people right here in our state. And I'm going to keep doing that because they're the ones that I represent, and they're the ideas that are leading our country forward with innovation and successful results.
Speaking of wildfires, Washington State has seen an alarming increase in so-called mega fires. So how will you advocate for Washington specifically to combat this issue?
I produced a 1-minute video in the midst of the smoke that we had in Seattle, which has gone on for the last 2 years, and the people of Eastern Washington have endured for years. Senator Cantwell, if you had been in Eastern Washington this summer like I was, you would have experienced that you could not see anything as you drove the highways of Eastern Washington in every corner of this region. And that is not because of firefighting money. There's a big difference between fighting fires and preventing fires. And what we're talking about is colossal, catastrophic fires that are totally to blame because Senator Cantwell, at least 14 times and maybe more, has blocked all efforts to have intelligent logging and reforms of our good forestry management. That is the cause of these colossal fires, and it's ruining our summers all throughout the state. And as your senator, I will fight to get logging, intelligent logging, sustainable logging back into our federal forests so they're not tinderboxes ready to burst into flame, and because there are no roads, unable to fight.
Senator Cantwell.
Well, this is so important that we realize that hotter, drier conditions are causing more fire starts. So I worked with WSU and the University of Washington and said, what should we do about this? And they basically said, do fuel reduction on your pine forests. So I went about getting an agreement from both Democrats and Republicans, the administration and those in the agencies to agree to this concept. And I can tell you it was a lot of hard work. But I used people like Vaughan Brothers Mills here in the Northwest who said, Maria, this is the way to go pursue this. Talk about taking the timber that you're going to harvest and put it into cross-laminated timber. That way people will see it's going to a dual purpose of reducing fuel and helping us for the future. So I'm so proud that here in Spokane, I was at the groundbreaking, we're going to have one of the first cross-laminated timber buildings in the entire state. It is going to be a model of the type of development that we can do. So because I came up with that strategy for pursuing a better management, I got both Democrats and Republicans to the table, and we solved the fire borrowing problem, so now we can do more fuel reduction for the future.
We are nearing the end of our time here this afternoon. Our final topic is one that is so important, and it is our veterans. We spoke with a number of veterans in preparation for this debate, and one Spokane area veteran told us, quote, a shortage of personnel at VA hospitals and service centers is causing delays in critical medical and social services for our veterans. What would you do to remedy this? We'll start with you, Ms. Hutchison. 1 minute, please.
Thank you. I am the daughter, wife, and mother of military officers. my second son, has just become a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up in socialized medicine in the military under my dad, and then when I married my husband, who was also a Marine. I care so deeply about the plight of our veterans, and in the town halls that I've been holding around the state, because my opponent would not debate, and I decided we've got to talk to the people, so I would go to many of the cities in this state and hold town halls. That is a question that comes up every single time. What are we doing for our veterans in the VA hospitals? Well, I've spent a lot of time in a VA hospital, and because of my dad, and I know that that they are inadequate for the need. I would recommend that our VA hospitals become centers of excellence for the needs of our wounded and our veterans who have unique military-associated diseases, ailments, injuries, and this includes PTSD. And then I believe that the most efficient way to deliver care to our veterans is allow their benefits to stay with them for their personal doctors close at home. We have veterans around the state that are traveling 2 hours just to see a doctor that's approved by the VA.
We'll have to cut you off there, Senator.
Well, my father served in the military in World War II. He served in the Navy, and his brother was a glider pilot and POW in World War II. So when he got out, I guarantee you, healthcare was the premier thing that they were concerned about. What we need to do here in Spokane is continue to support the VA facility and continue to modernize it. We need to upgrade the mental health facilities for PTSD and to make sure that we have more primary care infrastructure. That is in this year's MilCon budget, the budget that's supporting the construction of military in our state. And we, along with Senator Murray and many other of our congressional delegation, are continuing to say we want more investments in Spokane for military. The bill that we just passed in modernizing our VA also said that families can be reimbursed as caregivers in these situations, and it helped modernize medical electronic records so that our veterans get the better care by having managed across various services that they go to get, that it's all coordinated and better care. It's so important that we not privatize the VA. I've listened to what veterans say, and they tell me they don't want to privatize, but they do want, if they have emergency care, to be able to go to other facilities to get that necessary and emergent care.
Another big issue throughout Eastern Washington involves medical marijuana and our veterans. A growing number of military veterans do use medical marijuana to treat PTSD, chronic pain, a variety of ailments. Some say it could be a possible alternative to opioids. But right now, government physicians are barred from prescribing that to our veterans. Even when it's legal here in Washington state. Would you support changing this policy? And if so, how far should we as a nation go toward legalizing veterans' access to marijuana? Ms. Hutchison?
Well, I think medical research and scientific research is showing that there are substances in marijuana, just like there are substances in a lot of the plants that surround us, that definitely can help ease pain or cure even some diseases. And so I would be in favor of moving swiftly forward with the National Institutes of Health in order to implement the changes in the law that allow us to use those substances to provide medications that are uniquely suited for the needs of our veterans and pain management.
Senator?
I definitely support making sure that marijuana as a medical tool is further advanced, including access to veterans. You know, when you look at what Canada is doing to basically take that base root product and turn it into pill application, they are making more scientific R&D investment on the future opportunities and the research that will let patients know what it really can do for them. I want us to be right in line with that. I want us to have the research, the scientific information, and the access.
Do you have a rebuttal to that?
I don't think we disagree.
We're going to move on to closing statements now.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions. We are moving on to the closing statements. We flipped a coin, and Senator Cantwell, you begin. 1 minute, please.
Thank you so much for hosting this, for the moderators, for the audience, and of course, for my opponent, Susan Hutchison, for being here as well. This is an important time in our country because we have a lot of partisan divide. But I want you to know I will continue to work with anyone to get things done for the state of Washington. That's why I'm working on the first incentive for apprentice at the federal level so we can skill more people for the jobs that they need. It's why I worked across the aisle on the fire fix. It's why I worked hard to make sure that our sales tax deduction was made permanent, and why I support making sure the Ex-Im Bank works for all of us as we continue to make and grow things here in Eastern Washington. I want to focus on our economy of the future so that everybody has access to affordable health care and affordable housing and has good paying jobs. And that is going to be part of the legacy that we're growing right here in Eastern Washington, a great economy. So I ask people for your help and support today in sending me back to fight for you to be your voice in the United States Senate. And I only have one thing left to say. Go Cougars. I hope we really show what the Palouse is all about today.
Thank you. Ms. Hutchison, 1 minute.
Well, there's an old saying that says, no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And so we have heard from my opponent. She knows a lot about the other Washington. She's been there for 18 years. But she doesn't care so much about this Washington anymore. And I think nothing frames it better than her statement in the voter pamphlet about her community service. Every one of you has access to that, and you may have read it. I certainly have. And she says that her community service is hiking and climbing mountains. Well, you can compare that to mine or just about anybody in this room. Community service is helping others. But when you look at hers, it's about herself. And that underscores, of course, that Maria Cantwell is not caring for us. That's one of the reasons that I'm in this race, because I want you to know that when you elect me your senator, I will care for you. I will be here often. I will listen. I will hear. I will be your voice. I will speak for you. And when I'm elected your senator, it will be a bright new day in Washington State. Thank you.
That's it for this second and final debate for the U.S. Senate. Thanks to our lead sponsors, AARP of Washington, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Norcliffe Foundation, along with supporting sponsors, the Boeing Company, Smith Barbieri, Progressive Fund, and Washington Realtors.
Tonight's debate was organized by the Washington State Debate Coalition and its founder, Seattle City Club. The coalition comprised of civic leaders, nonpartisan organizations, colleges and universities, and media partners committed to setting a high standard for political debates.
An important reminder, ballots have been mailed to voters within the past few days. They must be postmarked or put in a drop box by 8 p.m. on Election Day. That, of course, is Tuesday, November 6th. Please make sure to get out and vote.
And thank you to our town hall audience and all the great questions. And thank you to Senator Maria Cantwell and Susan Hutchison. They took part in 2 coalition debates to discuss the issues in the race for U.S. Senate, so we thank you for that. And as we say goodbye from Spokane Community College, remember to vote, and let's give the candidates a round of applause.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks for doing
With the midterm elections just days away, watch the competition for the control of Congress on C-SPAN. See for yourself the candidates and the debates from key House and Senate races. Make C-SPAN your primary source for campaign 2018. Tomorrow, a debate in the race for the U.S. Senate seat in Massachusetts between incumbent Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren and Republican challenger Jeff Deal, a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Live coverage starts at 7 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN. With 17 days until the election, make C-SPAN your primary source for campaign 2018.
Wednesday morning, we're live in Concord, New Hampshire for the 48th stop on the C-SPAN Bus 50 Capitals Tour. New Hampshire Executive Council's Chris Pappas will be our guest on the bus during Washington Journal, starting at 9:30 a.m. Eastern.
Coming up in just a moment here, a debate in the race for the U.S. Senate seat in Ohio between incumbent Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown and Republican U.S. Congressman James Renacci. Live coverage on C-SPAN, your primary source for campaign 2018.
OSU Public Media and by NBC4.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the United States Senate debate between incumbent Democrat Sherrod Brown and his Republican challenger, Congressman Jim Renacci. I'm Colleen Marshall from NBC4 in Columbus, and in conjunction with our studio host, WOSU Public Media, the Ohio Debate Commission, and our broadcast partners all over the state of Ohio, we are pleased to bring you this important political conversation. We are coming to you tonight from the Fawcett Center on the campus of The Ohio State University. There is no studio audience tonight, just the candidates and our panel of journalists. Mike Thompson is the News and Public Affairs Director here at WOSU. Mike Jackson is the co-anchor at NBC4, and Mark Allen is the news anchor at WDTN in Dayton. And we welcome all three of you, gentlemen. And joining our panelists are the candidates. From Mansfield, Ohio, Senator Sherrod Brown. He has served in the U.S. Senate since 2006. And Representative Jim Renacci from Wadsworth, Ohio. Since 2010, he has represented Ohio's 16th congressional district. And gentlemen, we welcome both of you to this important conversation. The candidates have agreed tonight to alternating questions, 90 seconds for an answer, 60 seconds for a response, and then a 30-second rebuttal. By agreement, each will also give a 30-second opening statement, beginning now with Senator Sherrod Brown.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall, and thanks to you, thanks to Mr. Allen, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Thompson on the panel. Special thanks. We're joined, and certainly to the voters of Ohio watching tonight. We're joined by my daughter, Emily, and Elizabeth Brown, and Connie Schultz, my wife. I'm hopeful this debate will address issues, will stay on issues, and that we can discuss especially what we can do as a senator for Ohio families. I thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And Congressman Renacci, would you please give us your opening statement?
Well, thank you. And I want to thank the Debate Commission. I want to thank NBC and the affiliates and all those here today that will be asking questions. Again, today's debate will show two different people with two different visions. My vision is always for Ohio first and for Ohioans. My opponent's vision is for Washington first. And of course, his Democratic Party, and in many cases, his special interest money. Two different people, two different visions. I welcome the cameras and the people to get to know us both.
We thank both of you. And the candidates also agreed tonight to something a little out of the ordinary. At the start of each half hour, one of the candidates will have the opportunity to ask the other a question on a topic of their choice. The other candidate will have 90 seconds to respond. And by prior agreement, we begin with Senator Brown, who has his question for Representative Renacci.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Marshall. Congressman Renacci, 11 people every single day in Ohio, 11 Ohioans on the average, 11 Ohioans every day die of an opioid overdose. 11 died yesterday, 11 are dying today, 11 will die tomorrow, 11 will die Monday. Senator Portman and I, bipartisanly, have worked together for several years on combating this terrible public health threat with the CRIB Act, with the Interdict Act, with the STOP Act, with the CARE Act, with a number of pieces of legislation, many of which will be signed by the president in the next few days. My question is, you have attacked my work with Senator Portman against this public health crisis. What specifically do you think that Senator Portman and I have done wrong about this?
Well, thank you for the question. Again, my heart goes out every day to those that are lost with the opioid tragedy. And one of the things I've done to try and look into this is set up a panel of people who have been addicted and recovered, a panel of people who have lost their children, which is so sad, and then a panel of people who also have worked with the recovery. What I've said all along is that we need to be talking to the people. We need to be making sure that we're listening to the concerns. Number one, we need to talk about Daryl, who opened up the medicine cabinet and found opioids in that medicine cabinet. Or Michael, who is a businessman who lost his entire business because he opened up that cabinet and looked at those. Those are policies that we need to change. We also need to look at the parents who have lost their children. And when they lost their children, they tell me that the first thing that they ran into for their child came out of the center for recovery center was the drug dealer was right there handing them opiates again. These are the issues we should be looking at. And then the recovery centers. It's not all about money. The big concern I have is that when it comes down to money, these centers, they will tell you it's not a 6-month transition. In some cases, it's a 5-year transition. So we should be looking at the ways to change our policies in Washington, not always talking about money. Money helps, of course, but policies can change things, whether it's our education system, which opens up opportunities for VOTEC and allows somebody like Daryl to see other opportunities other than just the opioids that he went to. Those are opportunities that we can do and we can change. My heart continues to go out when I pull this panel together and realize how many people we are losing. We need to be able to work together. I promise to do that as your next senator.
All right, thank you, Congressman. And now I'll begin with the first question, and it goes to you, Senator Brown. The yearly federal deficit is approaching $1 trillion. That's $779 billion a year, 17% increase. So far, the tax cut that went into effect this year has failed to increase tax revenue to the levels expected or promised. At the same time, U.S. military spending has increased, contributing to the rising deficit. So would you support either reversing the tax cut or cutting military spending as a means of reducing the deficit?
During the debate on the tax cut, I went to the White House. A dozen of us met with the president. I suggested to the president we pass legislation that we passed my Working Families Tax Relief Act, which gives tax cuts to the middle class, not to the wealthy. You build the economy from the middle out. And I suggested the Patriot Corporation Act, that if companies play by the rules, if they pay their workers well, if they provide good insurance, health benefits, and retirement, they get a lower tax rate. This Congress, then the president said he liked the idea. Then the special interests went to work in the back room in the majority leader's office and the speaker's office. We ended up with a tax bill where more than 3/4 of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%. People like my opponent who thinks this tax bill is great. But the fact is that this tax cut, I would vote to change this tax cut so we focus on the middle class. We don't focus on giving tax cuts to the richest people in this country.
Congressman Renacci, your response?
Well, again, the difference between myself and my opponent is the tax cuts are working. As I travel the state, I see jobs being created. I see businesses continuing to grow. I'm happy to see that we now have employers who are giving employees. My opponent doesn't seem to be traveling the state and talking to the same people. I come around and I get thank yous from people saying, I now have more money in my paycheck. And they love to see that. At the same time, we have to have a strong military. We've let our military go down. So we need to be able to keep both. Listen, the Tax Cuts and Jobs bill gave us that 4.3% growth. We need to continue the growth and the jobs. We need to continue our economy growing. You go back into the late 90s and you'll find when we were actually balancing our budget, it was because of 6.2% growth, 6.5% growth. It was growth. We need to continue to move our growth forward. And I'm proud to say that I support the Tax Cut and Jobs bill because that's what will continue us to grow this economy and get us out of this deficit. We do not want to go back to the days, the last lost decade, as I call it, that Senator Brown and Barack Obama supported, where we had 1.8% growth. We had deficits continue to grow. And we do have to look at spending as well. Let's face it, we have a problem in our spending. We will have record revenues in the Treasury this year, record revenues, but we also have record spending. And I think until we evaluate our spending, but not defense spending, because defense spending has been let go for many, many years, we need to make sure that we're continuing to grow this economy, continue to have the job growth that we're having. We'll be able to grow our way out of this in many ways, and I think that's what we should continue to do.
And your response, sir?
I judge an economy not by corporate profits, not by the stock market. Of course, I hope there are corporate profits and the stock market does well. I judge the economy by what's happening with workers' wages. We've seen profits go like this. We've seen executive compensation explode. We've seen productivity go up, but workers aren't sharing that wealth. Wages are flat, and what Congressman Nacey doesn't tell us is once this, as soon as that bill was signed by the president, the bill that 3/4 of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%, Republican leadership immediately said, well, we've got to cut Medicare and Social Security or raise the eligibility age to pay for it. So in other words, they're advocating, Congressman Nacey's advocating, as is Republican leadership in Washington, advocating that we cut taxes on the wealthy, predominantly cut taxes on the wealthy, and it's paid for by hardworking Americans through a more difficult retirement because of cuts in Social Security and Medicare.
Right now, Mike Thompson has a question for Congressman Renacci. Mike?
Congressman, you say you support a market-based replacement of Obamacare. But most economists would say that in order to mandate that insurance companies cover pre-existing conditions, you either have to require people to buy health insurance or you have to have a government program to subsidize the uninsured. Otherwise, people just wait until they're sick or they're hurt to buy health insurance. How will your market-based system of health insurance work without government help?
Well, first off, I want an Affordable Care Act that is affordable. I want to look today, the Affordable Care Act isn't working. Premiums have gone up 132% on Ohioans since the Affordable Care Act was put in play. That's not affordable care. We have now taken care of a program that we absolutely take care of those in a safety net, and I'm okay and proud to do that. And the wealthy can pay their own way. But the problem is, Mary in the middle with 3 children, she can't afford her premiums and she can't afford the deductibles. We need a system that brings competition in, that brings transparency in, and bring costs down so everybody can afford it and have access to it.
Senator?
The most important thing to do with the healthcare system is to deal with the cost problem. High costs are driving the cost of Medicare. High drug costs especially are driving the cost of Medicare. This Congress does nothing to take on the drug companies. You've got a Congress that's the White House looks like a retreat for pharmaceutical representatives, for drug company CEOs. But the other thing is, Congressman Renacci more than 20 times has voted to eliminate the consumer protections for pre-existing condition. 5 million Ohioans, more than half the adults in this state, have a pre-existing condition. And so Congress, he has voted 20 times to take away, as Mr. Thompson suggests in his question, to take away those consumer protections for pre-existing conditions. So if he had had his way on this vote, if John McCain had stepped up and stopped it with his key vote in the U.S. Senate, the insurance companies would be able to deny coverage to people with cancer, deny coverage with people with Parkinson's or with diabetes or with osteoporosis. That's morally wrong. It's bad economics. It's bad healthcare policy. You'll never get the costs under control if we don't take on the drug companies for spiking costs the way that we do, and if we don't fight back against the insurance interests who are trying to allow cancellation of policies of people with pre-existing condition.
And your rebuttal, sir?
Well, again, the senator is lying. I have never said we need to get rid of pre-existing conditions. In fact, I've supported legislation to make sure it stays, the pre-existing conditions stay. But let's face it, he also talks about lobbyists, which is amazing. $500 million he's received from these lobbyists, the same lobbyists who are lobbying for prescription drugs. So again, these lies don't come to truth when it really comes down to we need to make sure that healthcare is affordable. We need to make sure that we are taking care of pre-existing conditions, and we need to make sure that the middle of the road, mom and pop that are fighting every day to cover their children can afford it and pay for it.
Mike has a follow-up.
Congressman, could you elaborate more on how competition and transparency will bring health care costs down?
Absolutely. Look, the best example I can give you is LASIK eye surgery. You know, there was a time where there was no competition in LASIK eye surgery. The prices were extremely high, and then all of a sudden there was competition. Today you have competition. Today you have billboards. Today you have costs that almost down to a couple $100. This is how you bring competition down. And by the way, you have to have transparency. Look, the biggest problem we have in our healthcare system is nobody knows what they're paying for when it comes down to. I was at the dentist the other day. He told me I had to do another x-ray. Nobody knows what the cost of those x-rays are, but he said it's covered. That's where we need transparency.
All right, now we go on to Mike Jackson, who has a question for Senator Brown.
Senator Brown, this question comes from Nidia. She's from Columbus, and she has a lot of concern about a lot of social issues we're facing today. She's particularly concerned about the relationship between our community and our police department. She wants to know, what approach would you take to improve both the drug problem that we currently face and the increasing racial divide?
Thank you for that question today, and to you, Mr. Jackson. I've been endorsed by the Fraternal Order of Police because I sit and listen to police officers and talk about the issues that they face every day. I've also been endorsed by all kinds of civil rights groups for the same reason that I sit and listen and talk to them about the issues they face. I think you start in part with the social issues that whether it's Appalachia or whether it's the inner city in cities in our state face. We have a government in Washington that continues to give tax cuts to the wealthiest people in this country. We don't invest in infrastructure. We don't invest in community policing. The governor, I know, when the governor candidate, when he, as Attorney General, has cut training for not spending money on training for police officers. And much of this, police officers want to do a good job. There are a few bad apples as there are in politics and anywhere else. But we don't focus on training. We don't focus on community relations. I know in Columbus they're working hard, that city council and police departments are doing that. But we've got to deal with the issues of housing better than we do. We've got to deal with the issues of income disparity and inequality than we do. But we have a government in Washington that cuts funding on housing. We have a government in Columbus that does the same. We have governments that give tax cuts to the wealthiest people and forget about helping struggling people, working families.
And your rebuttal, Congressman?
Well, again, I do think we have a divide, and especially in the inner city. And it's one of the reasons why I started the program called Opportunity Cleveland up in Cleveland. It's where you take youth and you start to make sure they have the opportunity to not only see mentors, but also see opportunities. And by the way, the best way to change this is a growing economy, to continue to make sure our economy is growing so jobs are around, so people can continue to find good jobs, good paying jobs. And then we need to direct many of our youth into those good paying jobs. Look, career politicians, Republicans and Democrats over the last 20 years have forgotten that it's not only about going to college, it's about making sure you have a career path that gives you the opportunity to live the American dream. We can do that if we allow people to see other opportunities other than college, have good mentorship programs inside the city, and have opportunities for youth to not only see police officers and be part of that and see how they do it, but also other opportunities as well.
Senator, you talked about the relationship with the police department, but I'm sorry, rebuttal. I'm sorry.
Okay. The other day I was speaking with, I met a fellow named Chad at a community picnic Connie and I went to in our neighborhood in Cleveland, and Chad had gone to a vocational school. He had gone to a proprietary school, it's called, to learn diesel mechanics. And he's doing well. He's got a pretty decent job, he says, that pays decent wages. But he's got student loans that are still pretty oppressive. And whether you go to Columbus State or Ohio State, whether you go to Otterbein or whether you go to Sinclair Community College or whether you go through apprentice program, you are faced with these high student loans. My opponent voted to deny 25 million Ohio Americans a chance for lower interest rates on their student loans so they could pay these back. How do you get working families, give them the opportunity if that's what we're doing?
I think Mike has to have a follow-up.
Okay, sure.
Senator, so many families, they already know about the challenges and the student loan debt. What would you do directly to try to improve this for the people you represent?
I would work on sentencing reform. I would work on Ban the Box, which I've done with Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. I would work on issues of, I oppose the efforts of the Republican Party all over the country to try to suppress the vote and roll back voting rights. There's clearly an attack across the board on all of those kinds of civil rights issues that undercut the relationship police and the community are trying to build. When you have a federal government that doesn't seem to care, it's awfully hard to build the relationship that police officers are trying to build and community leaders in Columbus and elsewhere are trying to build.
We're going to go now to Mark Allen, who has a question for Representative Renacci.
Colleen, thank you. Congressman, good evening.
Good evening.
We journalists have reported on countless mass shootings here in the U.S. in recent years. Almost without exception, within the next day or two, we learn of some degree of mental illness in the background of the gunman. As a first step in reducing mass gun violence here in America, is it time for Congress to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill?
It's interesting, and my heart goes out for those that we lose because of this type of violence. But you also mentioned something that's very important, mental illness. When I first got into the business world, and I was in the business world for almost 3 decades, I actually had facilities that took care of the mental health. The problem is our state and federal governments decided we were not going to take care of those with mental illness. And those facilities had to actually tell these individuals they could not stay at the facility any longer. So where did they go? They went out on the streets. Now they're in our prisons, they're out on our streets. My heart goes out because we do need to make sure we're changing our issue. We need to look at mental health. We need to look and make sure that mental health individuals are taken care of. We have a safety net for a lot of others. We need to make sure there's a safety net for those. When it comes to gun violence, we should be looking at background checks and making sure the same thing when someone has mental illness in their background, that they don't get those guns. These are things I can agree with and will continue to talk about. That's where we need to go. But it comes down to this mental illness issue that we seem to have forgotten about, and government has seemed to have forgotten about as well.
Senator?
Every time there's a gun shooting, defenders of the gun lobby send their thoughts and prayers to the victims, as we all do and as we all should. But then they refuse to close any of the gun loopholes. Get this, if you're on the terrorist watch list, if you're on the government terrorist watch list, you go out to John Glenn Airport in Columbus, you can't get on a plane, but you can buy an assault weapon. And you know what? We've tried to close that loophole time and time and time again in Congress, so mothers don't have to be afraid of sending their children to school. We've tried to close that loophole, and every time the gun lobby steps up, and every time Republican members of Congress defend the NRA and defend the gun lobby, they get tens of thousands of dollars in contributions. In fact, the gun lobby spent, we think, we don't know because it's all dark, undisclosed money, millions of dollars against me in my campaigns. But all these loopholes, assault weapons and the terrorist exemption and bump stocks and universal background checks, all these modest common sense reforms that Congress should be doing that 80 or 90% of the public wants to do, the gun lobby blocks it because they have a Congress that's in the pockets of the gun lobby.
Again, my opponent continues to talk about lobbyists, and he's collected almost $27 million this cycle from lobbyists. The truth of it is it gets back to the issue he continues not to talk about, which is mental health. And that's where we need to go. We already have cities that are gun-free. We already have a place in Washington, D.C. that was gun-free, that a member of Congress was shot. The problem is, if you look at the background of those individuals, there's mental health issues that we need to be taken care of. And we need to make sure we're redirecting our resources in that area.
Do you have a follow-up, Mark?
Colleen, I do. Congressman, back to my original question regarding keeping guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. Part of the challenge here, of course, is defining who is mentally ill. I mean, thousands, millions of Americans are treated for things like anxiety and depression. Would they be included in that group? Where is the line? Who draws that line?
Well, again, I think we've seen that in many, many cases where there is gun violence, too many times it's communication, too many times it's communication when it comes to mental illness. What we should be doing when it comes to mental illness, we have doctors who treat these individuals. We have individual friends who see it. There's a lot that can be done when it comes to just looking and comparing, and looking at our friends. Look, this is about continuing to make sure we are doing what's right for those law-abiding gun owners, and at the same time making sure we're taking care of those with mental illness.
Mr. Allen, that's exactly the point about mental illness. I hear over and over and over again, we've got to focus on mental health. Of course we do, but the people saying that, always in the pocket of the gun lobby, the people saying that are the same people that vote to cut spending on Medicaid over and over and over. I've stood with Governor Kasich, a Republican. I'm a Democrat, as most people know watching. I support him strongly in his expansion of Medicaid. Literally 500,000 Ohioans have gotten mental health treatment because of Medicaid expansion, yet Congress wants to cut that, and Congressman Renacci's first in line to try to cut it.
We're going to move on now to Mike Thompson, who has a question for Senator Brown.
Senator, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, has stepped up enforcement in Ohio since President Trump took office. Our region has seen a 36% increase in deportations in the first year of the Trump administration. Some Democrats call for the abolishment of ICE. Do you think ICE should be abolished? And how should we properly enforce our immigration laws?
No, you shouldn't abolish ICE. You should reform ICE and make it work better than it is. I take a backseat to no one in enforcing our borders with technology, helicopters, better trained ICE agents. The bill that I worked with, that I went to the White House to when the president signed it, the Interdict Act, to keep fentanyl and carfentanil from coming across our borders as best we can. But you don't do raids on people who are working hard and playing by the rules and let criminals who are here let them stay. I mean, the focus of ICE, the focus of the administration should be on deporting those people who have committed violent crimes. There are a whole lot of workers in this country that are not, that don't have documentation. There are millions. There should be a path to citizenship that they should earn, pay back taxes, all that. But these are people working hard. They're active in their church often. They're supporting their family. They're paying taxes. They're paying into Social Security. Instead, we deport people like that. In what the administration has done to break up families, to rip children from their parents, from their families, is immoral and just bad, stupid policy. When my wife and I were talking one day, we have 4 small grandchildren. They, at that age, if they were taken from, when you think about children being taken from their parents, at that age they don't even know the names of their parents in the city in which they live. Yet the government has ripped those kids from their parents and split up those families and doesn't seem to have any interest. And Congressman Renacci's never stood up to it and talked to his friend, the president, and said, let's aim this policy. Let's be a more humane nation when it comes to splitting up families.
And your response, sir?
Well, the senator again says he takes a back seat to no one, yet he does accept a lot of lobbyist money, and that's where he takes that front seat from. Let's face it, the senator supports sanctuary cities. That is not something Ohioans support. The senator supports no borders. That's something that Ohioans don't support. And look, the senator is again lying when he says that Jim Renacci didn't say publicly that we shouldn't be separating the children at the borders. I said that. I disagree with our president. But again, taking a back seat to no one, he's also saying that illegal immigration doesn't matter. He's saying that people that come here illegally, that they should be able to continue to work and provide. They're illegal. They're here illegally. Look, Sandy was in a plane with me flying back. She said, please, and coming back to Ohio, she is an Ohioan, please do not let illegal aliens get ahead of me. That's what's important. Let's make sure we have a legal system that allows a process for people to become legal citizens and not let illegal aliens just step in and come here.
And Senator?
Yeah, just for the record, and you're going to hear this over and over about campaign contributions. Every race I've ever been involved in, I've been outspent. All the outside money, the gun lobby, the tobacco companies, the oil industry, Wall Street that came at me in 2012. I don't whine about that. I chose to do this for a living. Just again, to put on the record, 155,000 people have contributed to my campaign. The average contribution is $42. And I take a backseat. I termed that term before, but I take a backseat to no one standing up to Wall Street and the drug companies and the oil industry when they attack the middle class in my state.
Thank you, Senator and Congressman. And we are taking one break during this program, and we're going to do that now. We'll be back in 60 seconds with Congressman Renacci's question for Senator Brown.
And as you just heard, a quick break from the Ohio Senate debate between Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown and Republican Congressman James Renacci. In the meantime, here's a look at some upcoming debates C-SPAN will be covering. With 17 days until the election, tomorrow, C-SPAN will take you live to Massachusetts for a debate in the Senate race with Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren and Republican Representative Jeff Deal. Live coverage begins at 7 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, your primary source for campaign 2018.
With the midterm elections just days away, watch the competition for the control of Congress on C-SPAN. See for yourself the candidates and the debates from key House and Senate races. Make C-SPAN your primary source for campaign 2018.
And now, C-SPAN will take you back live to Ohio as we continue with the Senate debate there.
To the U.S. Senate debate between Sherrod Brown and Jim Renacci. At the top of the hour, Senator Brown asked a question of Congressman Renacci. Now it's Mr. Renacci's turn to ask the question, and Senator, you will have 90 seconds to answer.
Senator, the Marietta Times this week had an editorial about domestic violence, and the editorial said one time is too many. In December of 2016, you asked Senator Franken to step down when it was learned that it was a substantiated sexual assault issue. You asked him to step down. Archie Parnell, he's a candidate for Congress in South Carolina. Congressman Tim Ryan said because of domestic abuse that happened to him over 40 years ago that he needs to step down. They said that that is not a standard of conduct that can be tolerated in the House or in the Senate. Senator, do you believe any instance of domestic violence or sexual assault disqualifies anyone from not only serving in the House or Senate, but serving in a public office?
Congressman Renacci, I've answered that question numerous times with you, numerous times. My former wife has asked that you stop attacking our family. The state's newspapers have asked you to stop making these kinds of disgusting allegations. You should be ashamed of yourself.
My question now goes to Congressman Renacci, and it happens to be in the same area. Your campaign and you have made quite an issue out of the decades-old allegations of domestic allegations involving Senator Brown and his former wife. You justified that by pointing to court documents, public records, and you said that was the reason that this should be part of the public discourse. Public records show Ivana Trump made allegations of physical and sexual assault against Donald Trump during their divorce in the 90s. In sworn deposition testimony and in pleadings that were filed with the court, those allegations were made. There is demonstrable evidence of infidelity involving Mr. Trump. By your own reasoning, should that have disqualified him from serving in public office?
Well, first off, I would say that I don't believe that any man that touches and harms a woman, that is just unacceptable, absolutely unacceptable. Number two, forgiveness doesn't mean it didn't happen. Number three, in the cases that I'm discussing with Senator Brown, these are documents. These are documents which show evidence of abuse with affidavits and also restraining orders. You can't get a judge to get a restraining order if something didn't happen. And in 2016, as I said earlier, he asked Senator Franken to step down because of allegations of sexual assault. Look, Senator Brown does not get grandfathered in on this issue. When it comes to the president, if the senator wants to run against the president in 2020, he can use that information against him. But this race here is about Jim Renacci and Senator Brown, and it's about whether he is disqualified to be a United States Senator because of accusations that, by the way, I know he has said that Jim Renacci has lied. Well, that means he's saying that the judge lied. When there is a restraining order, that means there's enough evidence to prove these things. So in the end, I think Republicans, Democrats, Independents, if they violate and they put their hand on a woman, none of them should be serving in the United States Senate or the House.
A brief follow-up, sir. You really didn't answer my question. Should it have disqualified President Trump from public service?
Well, I did answer your question because I said the same thing. This isn't about President Trump. Look, there are a lot of things about President Trump that he says or does that maybe I don't like, but I do like what he's doing in the economy. So in the end, if that's what wants to be used in the 2020 campaign, it can be used. But right now, we're talking about a Senate race. I'm not running for president. And again, if I was running for president, I've just said anyone, Republican, Democrat, Independent, who lays their hand on a woman disqualifies them from being in the House and the Senate.
All right. Our next question for Senator Brown comes from Mark Allen.
Senator, would you support a measure that would totally ban PAC money from election campaigns, thereby reducing the overall cost of campaigns and elections, which I think we can all agree are spiraling out of control, and make this vital process in our democracy more insulated from outside influences?
Absolutely, we should limit the amount of money in campaigns. The Citizens United case by this Supreme Court, by the sitting Supreme Court at the time, that just opened up the spigots, so all kinds of corporate money, all kinds of undisclosed so-called dark money. And I know it firsthand. Again, no complaints here, but in 2012, more money was spent against me by these special interests than any Senate race in the history of the United States at that point. The record's been broken since. But it's so important for people's voices to be heard, to begin to limit the money that we can spend that people can spend in campaigns. Democrats have tried repeatedly to overturn the Citizens United case. Senator McConnell, who is one of Congressman Nacey's biggest cheerleaders, Senator McConnell has blocked us from any efforts to try to overturn the Supreme Court case, Citizens United, which would limit money. So we should limit contributions. We should limit expenditures. We should certainly limit the outside dark money that comes into the state. I was Secretary of State a number of years ago. I led the charge to try to restrain big money in political campaigns in those days. I've been trying to do this for years. Unfortunately, these interest groups weigh in. They put their thumb on the scale. The Supreme Court continues to put its thumb on the scale of justice, supporting corporations over workers, supporting Wall Street over consumers, supporting healthcare companies over patients, and supporting the big dark money in politics that washes over this whole system. That's why that tax bill that went overwhelmingly for the wealthiest people, that's why that bill passed, because of special interest influence in Washington, and that's why I opposed it.
Congressman?
Well, look, I've always said that the easiest way to change Washington is two things. Eliminate some of this PAC money, especially the $27 million that my opponent has received, and put in term limits. Look, in 1997, my opponent even believed in term limits. The reason why you have to have term limits before you eliminate PAC money is because it would give nobody an opportunity to be able to compete with the ability to be able to raise money and to be able to turn around and run a campaign. We should look at eliminating as much money as we can. It is absolutely unbelievable that my opponent can raise $27 million. He used to be the #1 candidate for raising money in the Senate. I think he's $500 short of being #1. But the truth of it is that is causing us problems. So I'm all for term limits, which eliminates these career politicians who raise $27 million, and at the same time allowing people to get their message out in the best way they can without spending $27 million attacking their opponent.
Senator?
Again, 155,000 different contributors averaging $42 each. Congressman Nacey has a little trouble with the truth. I mean, he made $13 million and didn't try to avoid paying taxes on it until he got caught. He pals around with his crooked businessman in Canton who gave him $100,000 until he got caught. He was a lobbyist when he came to Congress, something I'd never seen before, until he got caught. He's had a little trouble with the truth, as he has in this campaign, as he has for the last 8 years in Congress, and I think that speaks for itself.
Mike Jackson has a question now for Representative Renacci.
Thanks, Colleen. Representative, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has updated its report on the situation, and it says the situation is getting worse. President Trump has said in the past that climate change is a hoax. This week, he does not deny climate change. It could go back. He said that climate change scientists have a political agenda. Mr. Renacci, do you agree with him?
Look, here's what I do believe. I believe in making Ohio first and making sure we're protecting Ohioans. We do have to make sure we have clean water and clean air, and we have to have all the above. Whether it's nuclear, whether it's wind and solar, we should be looking at all those. But we shouldn't be taking away, as Senator Brown wants to do when he was running around with Hillary Clinton, who was running for president. We shouldn't be trying to bankrupt the coal industry, which is important to Ohio. We should be actually growing the oil and gas industry, which is important to Ohio. That's why I stand with Ohio first and Ohioans. I do believe the other thing is you start to eliminate some of this coal and some of this oil that the Senator Brown would like to do. And by the way, again, when you talk about money, He's collected so many money from the special interest climate control area that he should, when he's probably cashing the checks that, he's forgetting about the people of Ohio. We cannot allow our costs of energy to go up by eliminating some of the assets that we have, which is clean coal, which is clean natural gas, and which is clean opportunities for jobs here in Ohio. So do I believe we need to make sure we protect our environment? Absolutely. Do I believe we need to make sure that we're protecting Ohioans and their costs of electricity? Absolutely as well. That's why I stand with Ohioans and Ohio First.
I'm proud that Ohio it has sort of all of the above. We have, I've traveled in my made in Toledo union-made Jeep to Western Ohio and seen wind turbines in Van Wert and Paulding. We have one of the greatest solar centers manufacturing in Northwest Ohio and Toledo. We really do have all of the above. But here's the thing, your question connected to Mr. Allen's question about all the outside dark money. The fact is, the Koch brothers, which is this big this huge behemoth corporation, mostly an energy company, owns the Republican Party lock, stock, and barrel. They can't even acknowledge that what 99% of scientists say, what most of the world's countries say, that climate change is a very real threat. Look at the problems, look at the weather patterns recently. You don't have to have great insight to see what this is doing to our planet, the costs it brings to the federal government and to those communities that get hit with wildfires and hurricanes and tornadoes and all the things brought up. It's something we should do. Congress won't do it because they're handcuffed by special interest money.
Congressman?
Again, my opponent continues to go back to special interest money, and he seems to want to disregard the $27 million he's gotten from the environmental groups. Look, when it comes to me, I want to make sure Ohio's first all the time. I want to look toward Ohioans. I want to make sure that the coal industry is growing here, clean coal. I want to make sure that the oil and gas industry is booming. I don't want Ohioans to have extra costs in their electricity because his special interest groups want him to ban coal and want him to ban oil and gas. He wants to talk about the Koch brothers. He should be talking about those that are donating to him.
Mike Thompson now with a question for Senator Brown.
Senator, the federal gas tax stands at 18 cents a gallon. The tax on diesel fuel stands at 24 cents. It has not been raised since 1993, and because of inflation, that money now can basically purchase half what it could then. And cars and trucks also are much more efficient, which means less gas tax money as well. With roads and bridges and highways in need of repair, would you support increasing the gas tax? And should more of that tax money go to pay for mass transit, which would lessen the burden on roads and highways?
Congressman Nacey has sponsored a bill to increase the gas tax, which is a tax mostly on middle-class Ohioans and working families that need to drive 10 or 20 or 30 miles to work, at the same time that he votes to give tax cuts to the wealthiest people. I've said this before, but it's important to keep thinking about that 3/4 of the benefits in that tax bill, more than 3/4 of the dollars in that tax bill, went to the wealthiest 1%, people like Congressman Nacey, and then he turns around and wants to raise the gas tax. I have come up with a plan with 5 other senators similar to what the president campaigned on. He's not really moved on it yet. A $1 trillion 10-year infrastructure plan paid for by closing tax loopholes, investing in our communities. It's clear that this state government, corrupt as it is, has failed on taking care of our highways and bridges and our roads and our water and sewer systems and our airports. We need an investment in infrastructure, but you don't do it by taxing working families. You do it by closing tax loopholes. Right now, if you shut production down in Mansfield or Garfield Heights or Grove City or Newark and you move overseas, and open a new factory there, you can collect a tax break. Close those loopholes, invest those loopholes in infrastructure. Don't put it on working families. Put it on those people that have abused the system in the past and that could afford a few dollars out of their pockets.
Your response?
Well, I wish the senator would have read my bill, because what it actually said was we need to put an inflation factor on the gas tax. Would have amounted to less than a penny. And then we need to force Congress over the next 4 years to come up with a plan and force them to do it. The problem is the senator has been around for 25 years. This problem continues to grow. And sadly enough, every child born in the Columbus hospitals today is going to pay for the problem that he is allowing to occur. We need to make sure, we had a hearing in the House. They said we need a user fee. There's only so many kind of user fees. There's gas tax, there is miles driven, there are weight, and there are tolls. Everybody, Republicans and Democrats on that panel, agreed that we needed a user fee that works and make sure we're protecting our children and grandchildren in the road. We should be paying for the roads that we're using. My bill just was forcing Congress to do something, and it gave them 4 years. That's the difference.
Thank you, sir. Representative Renee, I'm sorry, your response.
I hear Congressman Renacci continue to talk about the federal budget deficit. He said he was an architect of this tax bill that went to the wealthiest people in this country and caused stock buybacks to reward corporate executives and gave a 50% off coupon to companies on their taxes for companies that shut down in Columbus and move overseas. They save 50% of their gas tax. But that blew this huge hole in the federal budget deficit. And the leaders in Congress want to close that budget deficit by cutting Medicare and Social Security. You give tax breaks to the richest people, and then you stick it to hardworking Americans that have paid into Social Security and Medicare their whole lives. I think that's bad economics, and it's just wrong.
Representative Renacci will now get a question from Mark Allen.
Eileen, thank you. Congressman, there was actually a time, and it seems like a long time ago now, when compromise was not a dirty word in Washington, D.C. Rather, it used to be the way that things actually got done. In this day of great partisanship, little trust and middle ground, and both sides seemingly dug in for the long haul, how can Congress do the work that the voters, your employers, elected you to do?
Well, thank you, Mark, and I want to thank you for that question. Look, when I first went to Washington, I had no plans of going to Washington. I went there because my car dealership was taken away from me. And in the first hearing I got to, I saw Republicans and Democrats going at each other. When it came to me, the first thing I said was, why are we doing this? I want to listen to the witnesses and I want to move forward. And I asked, and at the end of the hearing, a gentleman from the other side, John Carney, walked over from Delaware and said, I appreciate what you did, and so many other Democrats appreciate what you did. Let's have breakfast, and we did. That breakfast has turned out to a weekly breakfast, a weekly bipartisan breakfast. And I am now one of the most 14%, one of the most bipartisan members of Congress. Every bill that I get, I try to bring a Democrat on board by compromising. And in the end, you don't have to compromise your principles or your values to get some things done. And I'm proud that group has gotten over 15 bills through the House and 7 that have been passed by the House and Senate and actually signed on by the President. These are the kind of ways we need to be able to work together. The real problem is when somebody like my opponent gets to Washington and is there for 20 to 30 years, and then his allegiance is more to the party and to his leader, that's when we don't get things done. And what I found out, even in my bipartisan group, was that even the senior members used to say, this is a good idea, but I can't do it because Nancy Pelosi's against me doing it. That is a problem. I've shown the leadership. I'm going to do that in the Senate as well. I believe that'll be the first thing I do, is to try and find people on the other side that I can work with and start having breakfast with as well.
Senator?
Yeah, congressmen will always show up to eat and to talk about bipartisanship, but let's look at what we actually do. I'm first senator in Ohio in 50 years to serve on the Agriculture Committee. I grew up milking cows on a Guernsey farm near Lexington, south of Mansfield in Richland County, 60 miles from where we stand. I went to work on this farm bill. It's a farm bill. It's a family farm bill. It's a conservation bill. It's a rural development bill, and it's a nutrition bill. I worked with Senator Grassley and Senator Ernst, Republicans from Iowa. I worked with Senator Thune, Republican from South Dakota. I worked with the chairman, Pat Roberts from Kansas. We crafted a bill that got 86 votes out of 98. 2 senators were absent. 86 out of 98, more votes than had ever passed, that had ever been in support of a farm bill. Then the bill went to the Congress and the House of Representatives, and they passed a partisan bill. We do it in the Senate. I know how to work. I've passed Russia sanctions bills with Senator McCain. I could go up and down the list of how many Republican senators I've co-sponsored. Only 3 senators in the last session of Congress introduced more bills that became law. Only 3 senators did more bills than I did. That tells you a lot about bipartisanship.
And Congressman?
My opponent likes to talk about the bills he does. I get that. The sad thing is, it's more about the bills that you get accomplished. I've actually been able to accomplish more when it comes to bills in my short term in Congress than he has over the last 25 years. The real issue here is when he talks even about farmers. I don't understand this. You could put a bill up every day, but when the farmers say to me they're tired of the regulations, they're tired of the water bill, they're tired of their attack when they go to transfer their farm to their family and they pay a death tax. These are the things that I'm going to stand up for with Ohio farmers and make sure Ohio's first, not Washington, and Washington first.
Mark, I believe you have a follow-up.
Gentlemen, that all sounds great, but with all due respect, and I'm trying to think, what would the voters say if they were sitting in my seat? The most recent example we all saw was the Kavanaugh hearings. I mean, it was, none of us have ever seen anything like it, as far as I can't think of this country being any more divided than we appeared to be watching that hearing play out on national television. Why are the voters to believe it's going to get any better? How does it get better? What's the first step? Who's going to make the first step?
And we'll give each of you 30 seconds to respond to that. Congressman?
Oh, I'm sorry. Look, I will tell you right now, that Senate hearing was a travesty. You had senators who already agreed to vote no, but they were causing all these issues. And then they take a guy with unsubstantiated claims and say he can't serve. These are the kind of problems. You want to fix it? We need to get term limits in place, and we need to eliminate people who are around for 25 years like my opponent, so that we can start having people who represent Ohio, not represent special interests, not represent their Democratic Party, and not represent Chuck Schumer.
And Senator Brown?
Yeah, I've heard Congressman Nacey over and over say how much he hates Washington, and that's fine. But I think it's because he went to Washington for the wrong reasons. He was a millionaire that was upset about his car dealership, and he went to Washington. He says that. He went to Washington and fought to help millionaires and billionaires. I went to Washington many years ago. I acknowledge I went to Washington many years ago to fight for health care. I promised I'd pay my own health insurance until Congress passed health insurance, universal health care. I paid my own health insurance for more than a decade. I don't own any corporate stocks. Connie and I don't buy corporate stocks because I'm the senior Democrat on the banking committee, and I think it's a conflict of interest. If you could get the conflicts of interest out of this Congress, it would be a whole lot better place.
And Mike?
Senator Brown, President Trump himself has called this midterm election primarily a referendum on him and his first 2 years in office. As candidates with your names on the ballots, do you agree?
I don't. Thank you, Mr. Jackson. I don't engage in political punditry. I work hard to serve my constituents. I don't really play in terms of if this is good for Trump or that's bad for Trump. I've worked against presidents in both parties when it comes to trade agreements. I oppose NAFTA, I oppose CAFTA, I oppose PNTR. I'm working with this president with whom I disagree most of the time. I'm working with him on renegotiation of NAFTA and tariffs and all those trade issues. So I run for office standing on my record. I wake up every day figuring how do I fight for Ohio workers regardless of whether they work in an office or a school or a factory or a construction site or in a factory of some sort. I make those calls based on what I think is good for Ohio. I know President Trump carried this state. I've carried this state twice, and I will continue to work to earn that trust.
Congressman?
Well, thank you. And again, I think in the last election in 2016, there was a referendum on what is going on in Washington, and that's why President Trump did win. There were people that started to realize that they were being forgotten. Even though Senator Brown talks about how he is working for those people, it seems like Ohioans rejected that because the senator traveled all over the state of Ohio with, at that time, Hillary Clinton saying, Hillary Clinton's for the working family. Hillary Clinton is going to protect your wages. In the end, Hillary Clinton was going to bankrupt the coal industry, Ohio coal industry. So look, 2016 was a referendum, and that's why Hillary Clinton lost, who Senator Brown said that he was so sorry to see that happen. Well, I think Ohioans have understood that doing the same thing over and over again, electing the same people over and over again, doesn't really mean the senators representing Ohioans. I will always support Ohio first and Ohioans.
And Senator?
Yeah, I see a Congress that continues to weigh in on the side of corporations over workers and Wall Street over consumers, whether it's the Supreme Court nomination where that's happened, whether it's the Senate leadership, which wrote a tax bill that overwhelmingly gave the special interests all this money, whether it's energy policy, whether it's health care legislation. The drug companies get away with murder in this state, frankly, with the prices they charge, and whether it's prescription drug consumers or financial services consumers, this government has sold them out.
That was our final panelist question. We begin closing statements now with Congressman Renacci.
Well, again, I want to thank the Debate Commission. I want to thank the Channel 5, and I want to thank the moderators here tonight as well. Look, in 1997, a United States congressman said that the biggest problem Ohioans have is they send people to Washington, and they spend 20 to 30 years there, and they forget about the people in Ohio. That congressman was Congressman Sherrod Brown. And the truth of it is, he has forgotten about Ohioans. He has voted, he's the fourth most liberal senator in Ohio. That doesn't represent Ohio. He votes 96% of the time with Chuck Schumer. That doesn't represent Ohio. He votes 94% of the time with Elizabeth Warren. That doesn't represent Ohio. He votes for sanctuary cities and supports sanctuary cities. That doesn't represent Ohio. He votes for partial birth abortions. Ohioans don't believe in that. In the end, he ran around the state in 2016 supporting Hillary Clinton, who wanted to bankrupt the coal industry. Look, as your senator, I will always think about Ohio first and Ohioans. I will make sure that I get up every day and want to continue this growth of 4.3%, continue the job growth that we're experiencing in this state. I want to make sure that Ohio is that place that it was when I came here 35 years and started my first business. I want to make sure that those 53 employees that Senator Brown forgot about in my dealership understand that I'm going to protect them. This is where our difference are. I want to support Ohio first. I want to make sure I'm supporting Ohioans. And again, in November 6th, I hope I can earn your vote.
And Senator Brown.
When you love your country, you fight for the people who make it work. I get up every day ready to make that fight for all Ohio workers, whether you punch a clock or swipe a badge, whether you work for tips or whether you work for a salary, whether you're raising children or whether you're caring for an aging adult, an aging parent. And I hear repeatedly that people are squeezed. I hear it in the grocery store. I hear it when I pick up a prescription for Connie. I hear it in factories. I hear it in office buildings where people think this government is rigged against them. They see businesses shut down in Dayton and Xenia and move overseas, build a factory and collect a tax break. They see a government, the Congress that rams through a special interest tax bill where the money goes to billionaires and millionaires, but then they see a congressional leadership say we got to pay for that tax cuts for the rich by cutting Medicare and Social Security. People are angry about that for a reason. They see special interest groups have their lobbyists and there's loopholes and there's not much left for working families in the middle class. Washington doesn't really understand the dignity of work. I do. I think if people get up and play by the rules, they ought to be able to get ahead. If people work all their lives and they try to save for their retirement and they contribute to their community, they ought to have a safe and secure retirement. I want your hard work to be rewarded so that people can have higher wages and better health care and a secure retirement, protecting Medicare and Medicaid. That's why I ask for your vote. Thank you.
We want to say thank you first to both of you for being with us, Congressman Renacci and Senator Brown. And we sure thank you for joining us tonight. This was the second of 3 debates between the 2 major party candidates for the United States Senate, Democrat Sherrod Brown and Republican Jim Renacci. Their third and final debate is set for this coming Friday, October 26th at Miami University in Oxford. Thank you to our panel of journalists, Mike Thompson, Mike Jackson, and Mark Allen for being with us. Thanks to WOSU, to the Ohio Debate Commission, and to all of you for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.
With the midterm elections just days away, watch the competition for the control of Congress on C-SPAN. See for yourself the candidates and the debates from key House and Senate races. Make C-SPAN your primary source for campaign 2018.
Tomorrow, a debate in the race for the U.S. Senate seat in Massachusetts between incumbent Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren and Republican challenger Jeff Deal, a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Live coverage starts at 7 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN. With 17 days until the election, make C-SPAN your primary source for campaign 2018. Coming up, President Trump at a campaign rally in Nevada. After that, former Vice President Joe Biden also at a campaign rally in Nevada. And then, a debate in the North Dakota Senate race. President Trump has been hitting the campaign trails out west. He ended his 3-day campaign tour in Elko, Nevada with a Make America Great Again rally. Joining him was Republican Nevada Senator Dean Heller, who's up for re-election. This is An Hour